saved from the outlaws by a man who then owned her. A Lakota chief owed her nothing and stayed. The rope was still around her wrists when I found her. Not the way you find something you were looking for. The way you ride into a thing before you know what it is. My horse smelled it first, that copper smell, blood on dry grass, and he slowed without me asking him to. I let him. He'd been alive as long as I had, near enough, and he'd learned to trust his nose the same as I'd learned to trust mine. She was in the ravine west of the creek where it bends north toward the flats, sitting up. That surprised me. Both wrists bound in front of her with the kind of knot that tells you about the man who tied it, hurried mean, the kind of man who ties a knot so it'll hurt more the longer you pull against it. She'd been pulling. Her wrists had gone dark. She looked up at me and she didn't scream, which told me something. Most white women I'd come across on the plains, and it wasn't many, not in those years, they screamed when they saw me. Or they went very still in a different way. The way a rabbit goes still. She went still in the way a person goes still, when they've already decided they're ready to die, and a new thing just appeared that they haven't categorized yet. I cut the rope, didn't say anything, there wasn't anything to say. I'd figure out what happened from the ground if I had to. The tracks were plain enough, 3 horses, 2 days back, men who'd come from the river road. But I didn't need her to tell me. She had a split lip and her dress was torn at the shoulder and there were bruises on her forearms that matched the shape of a man's hand. 2 of them, I thought. Maybe 3. She said, "Thank you." I nodded and got back on my horse. I was 50 yards out when she called after me. Her voice didn't crack, I'll give her that. I don't know where to go. I stopped. I didn't turn around for a moment. Just sat there on the horse and looked west, where the light was going orange and hard along the flat edge of the world. Behind me, maybe 200 yards, my camp. My fire, already banked down to coals. My people, what was left of them, 12 of us wintering in the canyon that season, more women and children than men, half the horses traded off the autumn before. Behind me, everything I was responsible for. And behind that, her voice, quiet, not asking for pity, just telling me a fact. I turned around. My name is a thing I won't try to translate for you. Translations always take something out. The men I fought beside called me Crow Eater, which was an old joke that went back 15 years and a bet I lost on the Powder River. The soldiers called me something else, what they thought my name meant, but they got it wrong. My mother called me by the name she gave me when I was born, and I haven't heard that name out loud since she died. I don't think you need to know what the white woman called me. She called me something she invented the first night. It was respectful. I let it stand. I was 52 years old that winter. I know because it was the winter of the year they surveyed the land to the east and built the first poles for the wire fence, and I counted backward from that to when I was born, which was in the spring when the plums bloomed, and I came up with 52. I don't know what I looked like to her. I know what I looked like to most people by then. I had a scar that ran from just below my left ear to the corner of my jaw, a knife scar, 12 years old by then and white against the skin. I wore my hair loose that season because the braid on the left side had a thing wrong with it that I was letting grow out. I was not a small man. I'd been larger in my 30s when I carried more weight, but even at 52, I was not a man who got looked over. What she saw when she saw me, I don't know. She told me later, but that's later. I brought her to camp because there was nowhere else to take her. The nearest town was Harker's Crossing, 3 days' ride, and in the state she was in she wouldn't make it alone, and I wasn't going to spend 6 days on a supply run to a town where 3 men who'd done this to her might still be drinking. I had 11 people depending on that canyon camp and supplies that were already thinner than I wanted. She rode double behind me. Not holding on at first, holding the back of the saddle instead, which I noticed, which told me she wasn't going to ask for more than she needed to get through. After about a mile she was swaying and I said, without looking back, "Hold on to me." She did. Her hands were cold even through my coat. The women at camp looked at her the way women look at a thing that has arrived without warning and needs to be assessed fast. My cousin's wife, stands looking, was the one who made the decision. I saw it happen in her face, that quick shut door of judgment followed by the open door of decision. And she took the white woman by the arm and led her to the fire. I unsaddled the horse. I didn't check on her that night. That was Stan's Looking's territory, and Stan's Looking didn't need me standing there. I ate, I slept. I was up before dawn and out to check the snares. In the morning she was awake, sitting outside the lodge with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the light come up. She had a clay cup of something, Stan's Looking's willow bark tea, from the smell of it. She looked at me when I came back with the rabbits and she said, "I'm Clara Hewitt. My husband had a claim on the Cottonwood Fork. He died in September." I nodded. "Those men came in November," she said, "when the ground froze." She looked back at the sunrise. "I don't have anywhere to go back to." I thought about that, then I said, "You can stay until the thaw," which was 3 months, give or take. She said, "All right." That was the whole conversation. I hung the rabbits and went to work. Here is what she was for those 3 months. She was useful. I don't mean that as a diminishment. I mean it as the highest thing I could say about a person that winter. She didn't ask for allowances. She watched how the women worked and she figured out what she could do, and she did it without being asked. She had some skill with a needle, better than most of our women, and Stan's Looking put her to work on the winter mending inside of a week. She was slow at first. She didn't know the sinew, didn't know the way the hides moved, but she was careful, and careful is more useful than fast. She was quiet in the right ways. She didn't chatter. She didn't ask the questions that white people usually asked, the ones that were really statements dressed up as questions, the ones that started with "don't you" and "why don't you." She watched. She learned 3 words of the language and used them in the right places, which made my cousin's children laugh, which was a sound I needed that winter. And she healed. I watched that happen without meaning to. The split lip first, then the deep bruises, then the thing inside her that had broken. I couldn't see that one, but I could see when it started mending, the way you can see a horse that was spooked starting to trust its feet again. I didn't seek her out. I want to be clear about that. I had enough to do. The winter was harder than expected, and one of the horses went lame, and I had 3 mouths to feed that were children and 2 elders who weren't eating enough. I didn't have room in my days for a white woman working through her grief. But there were evenings, after the fire when the camp settled. She would sit outside the main lodge because she said the smoke made her eyes water, which was true for everyone, but most of us had learned not to notice. And I would sometimes sit outside too, because I slept better if I took an hour alone at the end of the day. And we would sit there, not always talking, with the cold coming down from the canyon walls, and the stars so thick they looked like something had been spilled. She asked me once about the scar. Not the way people usually asked, which was with that particular kind of boldness that's really just bad manners dressed up as courage. She asked the way you ask about a thing when you've been sitting with the question for a while and decided it was a real question and not just curiosity. "Does it hurt still?" she said. "Or is that a rude thing to ask?" "It doesn't hurt," I said. "It pulled for about 2 years. Now it's just there." "I have one," she said. She touched her hairline above her left ear where her hair covered it. "From when I was 8, a horse kicked me. It pulled for a long time too." I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. We sat there. That was how it went most nights. Not much said, but the weight of the silence had changed from those first weeks. You can tell the difference between a silence where 2 people are just occupying the same space and a silence where 2 people have decided the other one is worth sitting next to. I noticed that change. I filed it away and didn't look at it too closely. In January, 2 men came. Not the same men who'd hurt her, different men, though the same type of men, which is a type I'd known my whole life. They came up the canyon on horseback, which meant they'd tracked us, which meant they'd been watching. They had that particular arrangement of weapons on a man that means he's thought about what he might need to do, not just what he might run into. I met them at the canyon mouth alone, which is how you meet that kind of man. You don't bring people behind you into that conversation. They were looking for a white woman, they said. Woman named Clara Hewitt. They'd heard she was living with Indians. Her family back east was concerned. They'd come to bring her home. I listened to all of this. Then I said, "There's no white woman here." The older one looked at me for a long time. He had a beard that grew in reddish and eyes that were the color of creek water after a rain, gray and unclear. He was the kind of man who was used to being the most dangerous thing in a conversation, and he was recalibrating. I watched him do it. He said, "We've been told different." "You've been told wrong," I said. "Maybe we should look for ourselves." The cold came down from the canyon. My horse shifted weight. I didn't shift. I said no. Just that one word. With everything behind it that needed to be behind it. The younger one started to say something, and the older one put a hand out without looking at him. They stared at me for a moment more. Then they left. I went back to camp. Clara was at the fire with Stans looking. She looked up when I came back. She'd heard the horses. Everyone had heard the horses. She said, "Were those?" "They're gone," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Will they come back?" "Maybe," I said. "Not soon." She nodded. Stans looking handed me a bowl of something and I ate it, and that was the end of that conversation. But I felt her watching me the rest of that evening. Not the way a person watches someone they're afraid of. The other way. February was the worst month. One of the elders died, an old man named after a hawk. I won't give you his real name, who had been with my grandfather and who knew things nobody else knew anymore. That kind of loss doesn't just hurt. It takes something with it, something that doesn't come back. I built his scaffold myself in the old way, and I spent a day and a half doing it and not speaking to anyone. When I came back to camp the second night, hollow-gutted and cold through, Clara was awake. The others were asleep. She kept the main fire burning, which she didn't have to do, and she was sitting next to it with a blanket and that clay cup, and she didn't say anything when I sat down. Didn't ask how I was. Didn't try to comfort me, which I wouldn't have wanted. She just handed me a cup of the same tea without looking at me, and I took it, and we sat there until the fire burned low. At some point I said, out of nowhere, I hadn't planned to say it, "He taught me how to read weather, from when I was 9 years old. He said I asked too many questions and I should learn to read the sky instead." I paused. He was right. She said, "Did you ask fewer questions after that?" I thought about it. No. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. First time I'd heard that sound from her. I didn't say anything else. But something shifted that night, some last piece of whatever I'd been holding at arm's length. The thaw came early that year, which was a surprise. By the first week of March, the creek was running fast and the ground was soft enough to work, and the light had that particular quality it gets when spring is really coming. Sharper, somehow, like everything is waking up and the edges of things are getting cleaner. I saddled a horse to ride toward Harker's Crossing. Not all the way, just far enough to see what the road looked like, whether there'd been any soldiers moving through. Clara found me at the picket line. She said, "You're going to check the road?" "Yes, to see if it's safe for me to leave." I adjusted the cinch. The horse snorted. "Spring, you said you'd go at the thaw." I said, "All right," she said. "When you said I could stay until the thaw, I said all right. I didn't say I wanted to go." I stopped what I was doing. She was standing about 4 feet away, and she had her arms crossed over her chest, not out of anger but the way you cross your arms when you're holding yourself steady for something. The morning light was flat and bright, and her hair was loose, and the wind was moving it across her face, and she didn't push it away. She just looked at me. She said, "You've kept me safe since November. You never asked for anything. You never made me feel like I owed you, and God knows you could have." She paused. "I know what I owe you. I know you wouldn't take payment even if I tried, so I'm telling you something different." Another pause, shorter. I don't want to go back to a town where I'm a widow with a dead claim and a story no one believes. I want to stay here, with you." She looked at me straight. "If you'll have me." The wind moved. The creek was running loud. I looked at this woman, the straight line of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes, the fact that she'd made it through a winter in a canyon camp with 12 people who had no particular reason to welcome her. And she'd done it with her chin up and her hands useful and her complaints to herself. And she'd never once tried to make me feel like I owed her anything for surviving it. I said, "You understand what that means, what people will say." "I've had things said about me since November," she said. "I'm past caring what people say." I looked at her for a moment more. Then I said, "There's a way if you want to do it right, old way if you're willing." She didn't hesitate. She said, "Tell me what it is." "We did it right. I'm not going to explain it to you. It's not mine to explain to strangers, the details of it. What I'll tell you is that it took 3 days, and Stan's looking was the one who prepared her, and the old women who were left did the things they knew how to do, and the children thought the whole affair was the most interesting thing that had happened since the January the elk came down into the canyon. I'll tell you that at the end of it there was a fire and a meal, and we sat together in front of the people I was responsible for, and it was not a small thing. And I'll tell you what she looked like. She wore what Stan's looking had made for her, which was deer hide and blue beads along the collar, and her hair was braided the way the women had shown her, and she sat beside me in front of the fire and she didn't look uncertain. She looked like a person who had made a decision, and arrived at the place the decision led, and was content with what they found there. She had her hands in her lap and her back straight and the firelight was on her face, and at some point she turned and looked at me, not for reassurance, not to check if she was doing it right, just to look at me, and there was something in her face that I hadn't seen from anyone in a long time. It was the look of a person who sees you fully and has decided you're worth it. I don't know what my face did. I'm not a man who monitors his own face, but I put my hand over hers on her knee, and she turned her hand over and held mine, and that was the whole of it. I want to tell you a few things about the years after. The 2 men came back in April with 3 more men, and I met them at the canyon mouth the same way, and this time Clara was with me, which was her choice. And when the reddish-bearded one looked at her and said, "Ma'am, you don't have to," she said, "I know I don't," in a voice that ended that sentence. They left and they didn't come back. I'll tell you about a morning in our second autumn when I came back from a 3-day ride, and she was at the creek washing something, and she didn't hear me come up, and I stood on the bank above her and watched her for a minute. The way she moved, easy with herself, the way she'd learned to move out here, not the careful stepping of her first weeks but something looser, belonging to the ground, and something in my chest felt different than it had felt since I was a much younger man. I'll tell you she learned enough of the language over time that she could argue with Stan's looking, which was a high bar, and she cleared it. And that Stan's looking called her by a name she'd given her in the second winter, which translated roughly to the one who asks before she acts, which was the best compliment Stan's looking knew how to give. I'll tell you we had a son, born in the spring, in the year the second wire fence went up to the east. I'll tell you I held him and thought about the old man who taught me to read weather, and I taught that boy the same things, and he asked too many questions, same as me, and he turned out all right. I'm an old man telling you this now, not as old as I sometimes feel, but old enough. Here is what I know. I spent the first 52 years of my life being a certain kind of man, a man who carried things alone, who was careful about what he let matter to him, who had been respected and feared but not for a long time seen, not in that way, not by someone who was choosing freely with both eyes open, knowing exactly what it cost. She walked into that canyon with nothing left and she built a life in it, and she chose to build it beside me, and she kept choosing it year after year through everything that came. That's not a small thing. A man who gets that from a woman gets chosen, not rescued, not pitied, not tolerated, but chosen cleanly by someone with the spine to mean it. That man has been given something most men never find. The rope she had on her wrists when I found her, I kept it. I don't know exactly why. It's in the bottom of a box with a few other things. The hawk feather from the old man's scaffold. A button from the dress she wore the day she found me at the picket line and told me she wasn't leaving. I take it out sometimes, not often, when I need to remember how things start, rough, knotted, cold, not yet finished, and then I put it back and I go find her. That's how it ends every time. I go find her,